Welcome back. In today's video, we'll study Daniel 1 verses 3 to 4. In verses 1 to 2, we learned that Israel's God, Yahweh, had given the king of Judah and the sacred vessels from the Jerusalem temple into the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and the Nebuchadnezzar had taken the vessels to Babylon to put them into the house of his God. Well, in verse 3, we read, "Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans." So in addition to taking the vessels from the temple, Nebuchadnezzar also commands one of his chief officials to take some of the brightest and best of the Judean young men as exiles to Babylon to serve at his court. Chief eunuch is literally in the text, chief of his eunuchs, that's in Hebrew. And so that raises the question, was Daniel a eunuch? But we'll come back to that a little bit later in the video. Royal family in the text is literally seed of kingship. And youths or young men, the Hebrew term is yeladim, would likely indicate someone in their teens or younger. Whilst we don't know exactly how old Daniel and his friends were at the time that they were brought to Babylon, the fact that Daniel was still alive in the third year of Cyrus, somewhere around 536 BC, almost 70 years after he was taken to Babylon in the first place, that would suggest that he was relatively young at this time, and so many suggest that he would have been a teenager, perhaps as young as 15. I want to notice that the appearance of these young men was important to the Babylonians as they sought to bring them into the court of the king. They wanted young men of good appearance and without physical defect. And notice as well that their mental ability was important for them to serve in the Babylonian court. Nebuchadnezzar, it seems, only wanted smart, good-looking people in his court. And his plan was to enhance their appearance by nourishing them with food from his table and their intelligence with Babylonian education. The plan was really to reprogram them by indoctrinating them with the literature and language of the Babylonians. And in the ESV text, you'll notice it speaks of the literature and language of the Chaldeans. In the NIV, I believe it says Babylonians. Really, that word Chaldean was originally a term that referred to Babylon's ruling ethnic group, which came in time to simply mean Babylonian. Well, what is the literature and language of the Babylonians? Now, Aramaic was the lingua franca of the Babylonian Empire and the spoken language of the Babylonians at this time. But the native or ancient language of the Babylonians was Akkadian, an ancient language only used by scribes for the religious and scholarly texts in Daniel's time, and written in a wedge-type script called cuneiform. This language would have been difficult to learn. As the scholarly or scribal Babylonian language in Daniel's day was Akkadian, and Daniel and his friends were given new personal names in Akkadian, they presumably also studied the Akkadian language that includes, and it would have included a whole range of historical, religious, magical, economic, and legal texts in Akkadian, much of which we have artifacts of today. And this would have included things like the laws of Hammurabi, widely copied in the Neo-Babylonian times, the Gilgamesh epic, which contains a version of the flood story, the Enuma Elish, which was a Babylonian creation story of how Marduk, the god of Babylon, became the chief or the king of the gods, and the Babylonian Chronicle, which gives historical data concerning activities of Babylonian kings and the like. So we're talking about, when we say the language and literature of the Babylonians, the Akkadian language, and these myths and epics of Mesopotamian culture, like Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis epic, and the Gilgamesh epic, and divination texts in which they would teach how to interpret dreams, animal internal organs, and also how to interpret the signs of astrology. Well, Tremper Longman in How to Read Daniel offers this explanation. He says, Daniel and his friends would have learned Akkadian by reading the well-known myths and epics of Mesopotamian culture, for instance, the creation epics Enuma Elish and Atrahasis. The latter would have included not only an account of the creation of the cosmos and humanity by their chief god Marduk and other pagan deities, but also the Babylonian version of the flood. Daniel and his friends would also have read about the flood in the Gilgamesh epic, but rather than featuring Yahweh their god, the Babylonian version speaks of Enlil, whose plan to destroy humanity by means of the flood was spoiled by the god Ea, who told Utnapishtim to build an ark so that he, his family, some others, and the animals could survive the flood. The required courses that Daniel and his friends would have taken extolled gods that they would have considered false gods. These myths and epics would have been blasphemous, attributing creation and flood not to their god Yahweh, but rather to others. So essentially, what we're dealing with is a context in which what they were being taught was reprogramming them with something that they would have considered to be a challenge to their faith. And so, if we think about it, their curriculum would have included the omen literature, that is, literature about how to read omens, with the expectation that Daniel would serve as a seer or expert in divination, and would have included various writings about the magical arts, things like dream books, celestial omen collections, and extipacy manuals. Extipacy has to do with reading and interpreting the internal organs of animals. Babylonian wise men would have been trained in the techniques of all types of divination. Perhaps the best attested type of divination of the day was the interpretation of internal organs of sheep, especially the liver. And the study of the stars, astrology, was yet another means of probing future events, and the list could go on and on. But most significantly, dream interpretation in Babylon will play a significant role in Daniel 2 and 4. And Babylonian dream interpretation operated differently than it did in the Old Testament. In Babylon, dreamers who needed interpretation would tell the interpreter the contents of their dream, and then the diviner would consult dream commentaries in order to determine the meaning. So says Tremper Longman in How to Read Daniel. He concludes, I think quite usefully, that in a word, this training was hostile to their deep faith in Yahweh. It promoted false gods and used pagan methods of divination. The Babylonian training and education was ultimately toxic to the faith of these young men. Well, we come to that question I promised that we would talk about earlier, whether Daniel was a eunuch. And in Daniel 1, verse 3, as I pointed out, it says that the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel into Babylon. And because of that word, the chief of the eunuchs, literally the chief of his eunuchs, it leads to the question, was Daniel a eunuch? But if you look at other translations, you will see, for example, the NIV says the chief of his court officials, and the NASB, fairly literal translation, says the chief of his officials, and in the footnote, or eunuchs. So, which is it? Well, the actual Hebrew word here is the word saris, and that word is translated eunuch, or could be simply translated official. Potiphar, for instance, who had a wife, is called a saris in Genesis 39:1. And it's been said that any association with eunuchs of this word is secondary, going back to the common practice of employing eunuchs in positions of intimate contact with the royal court. For example, in caring for wives, example, the two officials in Esther 2:3 and 2:14. So Daniel is not necessarily a eunuch. Notice that the young men that were selected were to be without blemish, and that the Hebrews were without any physical defect. And that probably precludes their being eunuchs at that time, since Leviticus 21 identifies in verses 17 to 20 crushed testicles as a defect. You could also look at Deuteronomy 23:1. But it is also interesting that there's no mention of Daniel having a family in the book. Perhaps that just didn't arise in the story. But I think the idea that I'm trying to convey is it's not entirely clear one way or the other whether he was a eunuch or not. So I don't think we can be dogmatic about it, but I do think the word that is translated eunuch could quite simply be referring to an official, and it just sort of developed in the course of how the word was used that secondary association, eunuchs, kind of would have fallen by the way, and persons who would have heard the text would have understood that it really was referring to the chief of his officials. Well, I think that's enough on that. I want you to notice, however, that the deportation of the members of the royal family, called the seed of the kingship, actually fulfills Isaiah 39. We read there that Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up this day, till this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." So this occurs after some Babylonians come to visit Hezekiah, and he shows them everything in his treasury. And Isaiah warns him that what will happen in the future is that the Babylonians are going to deport some of his sons. Sons there meaning not just his immediate sons, but really the offspring, those who come from his line. Now, this is a prophecy about the plundering of Jerusalem, and eunuchs here in Isaiah 39 is the same word Cyrus that is used in Daniel 1:3. And so most likely it means officials and not eunuchs in the sense of being castrated. Ultimately, the exile of the royal seed, including Daniel and his friends, fulfills God's warning that covenant violations would lead to exile. And those warnings are given in Leviticus 26, verse 33, and Deuteronomy 28, verse 64, where God says that he's going to scatter them amongst the nations if they do not obey the Torah. The context provided by the wider biblical story helps us to understand that it is Israel's covenant unfaithfulness that explains why Yahweh has handed over Judah and its king to Nebuchadnezzar, leading to the exile, the deportation of its people, and the situation that we find Daniel and his three friends in. In our next video, we'll pick up the narrative again from verses 3 to 4 and study through to the end of verse 7. I hope that you will join us then.